If aliens ever dig us up, they're going to be confused. We have skyscrapers shaped like tombs, cemeteries that cost more per square foot than downtown condos, people burning money made of paper to send it to dead relatives who, presumably, don't have a banking system. You'd think we were the species that works for the dead. And we always have. From the first painted cave to the last marble crypt, humanity has treated death less like a tragedy and more like an employer. We didn't just fear it. We built our schedules around it. Take Sungzir, Russia, about 34,000 years ago. 2 kids buried head to head, wrapped in mammoth ivory beads, 10,000 of them. Every bead took about an hour to carve. That's years of labor spent decorating corpses. Anthropologists call it costly signaling. Translation: this community was broadcasting. Look how much we'll give to keep our dead on our side. You don't waste that kind of time unless death's on the payroll. Jump ahead to Jericho, 7,000 BCE. Families dug up Grandma's skull, plastered over the bone with gypsum, and set shells where her eyes used to be. Then they kept her in the house. Imagine Airbnb-ing that. The dead weren't gone. They were roommates. The same pattern shows up at Çatalhöyük in Anatolia. Burials under floors, skulls retrieved for ceremonies, sometimes repainted. Death wasn't hidden. It was furniture. By the Shang dynasty in China, around 1250 BCE, this turned into government policy. Anyang's royal tombs have whole entourages buried alive beside the ruler. Oracle bones record divinations asking dead ancestors for advice on harvests, war, childbirth, you name it. Blood was bureaucracy. The king ruled because his ancestors approved the minutes. Meanwhile, Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, took a darker route. Their afterlife was a basement apartment where souls drank muddy water forever. But instead of rejecting it, they institutionalized it. Clay tablets from Ur and Nippur list daily rations for the dead. Beer, bread, and oil offerings placed in household altars and temple kitchens. It kept both spirits and bakers employed. The economy of death was already global by 2000 BCE. Egypt, though, Egypt turned dying into a brand. Around 2600 BCE, Pharaoh Djoser and his architect Imhotep stacked 6 limestone mastabas into the world's first pyramid. The idea caught on. Fast forward a few dynasties, and you have an entire labor force. Stonemasons, embalmers, scribes, whose job description was eternity maintenance. Mummification wasn't superstition. It was supply chain management for the soul. Your liver went into a jar guarded by a falcon-headed god. Your heart faced a cosmic audit against a feather. Fail the audit, get eaten by a demon crocodile. Pass it. Enjoy eternity with free-grain shipments. Egyptians didn't fear death. They just refused to enter it unprepared. The Greeks gave death homework. Around the 8th century BCE, they start burying people with coins, payment for Charon, the ferryman of Hades. Forget Apple Pay. This was literal, under-the-tongue currency. Athenian funerals doubled as philosophy seminars. What survives, the body or the name? Homer's Achilles answers that in the Odyssey. Even heroes hate being dead. But the Greeks kept debating it, carving epitaphs that sound like Twitter bios, short, clever, and painfully self-aware. Then come the Romans, who managed to turn death into infrastructure. The first recorded gladiatorial combat? 264 BCE. 3 pairs of slaves fought to the death in the Forum Boarium as a favor to a dead aristocrat. A century later, Julius Caesar threw 320 pairs of fighters for his father's funeral. By the time the Colosseum opened in 80 CE, blood had become a civic utility. Part entertainment, part ritual, part tax write-off. Munus meant both duty and gift. Every stab was a donation to the social order. Roman tombs lined highways for visibility. Do not pass by without reading, many of them warn, which is ancient Latin for like and subscribe. The logic was consistent from peasant altars to imperial arenas. Remind the living that death's watching and the living behave. Fear works, awe works better. Across the ocean, the same math played out in maize and obsidian. Classic Maya cities like Yaxchilan and Copan in the 7th and 8th centuries CE depict royal bloodletting as civic duty. Lady Kabul's Chouk's lintel from 709 CE shows her pulling a barbed rope through her tongue while her husband holds a torch. The blood feeds a vision serpent, literally fuel for contact with ancestors. It's gruesome if you're squeamish, but spiritually, it's payroll again. The rulers bleed so the universe keeps its lights on. The Aztecs industrialized the concept. At Tenochtitlan's Templo Mayor around 1487 CE, the Huey Tlatoani Ixhuitzotl rededicated the pyramid with human offerings on a scale we can verify archaeologically. Excavations of the Tzompantli skull rack show rows of perforated crania, cataloged like inventory. Their cosmology said the sun required hearts to rise each day. No hearts, no sunrise. It wasn't cruelty. It was astrophysics, Mesoamerican edition. Even the Inca carried the logic skyward. Around 1500 CE, they climbed volcanoes like Lulailaco, 6,700 meters above sea level, to bury ritually chosen children with fine textiles and coca leaves. The Lulailaco maiden wasn't executed, she was elevated, literally. Frozen in place, perfect hair braid intact, she's Anthropology's most poignant evidence that some deaths were considered promotions. You can trace the same current through Norse boat burials. Oseberg, 834 CE, 2 women with sleds, textiles, and sacrificed animals. Or Japanese Kofun tombs, 5th century CE keyhole mounds packed with bronze mirrors and weapons. Different continents, same heartbeat. Death organizes the living. So no, ancient people weren't afraid of death. They were in business with it. It regulated calendars, justified kings, and paid entire industries. The pharaoh needed mortuary priests. The emperor needed arena contractors. The Maya lord needed artisans who could carve stone veins for eternity. Death wasn't a void. It was a career path. If you want to understand why death never went out of fashion, follow the money. Civilizations didn't just mourn their dead, they fed them. With grain, blood, incense, stone, and overtime pay. Every offering had an invoice behind it. Death wasn't an ending. It was a payroll department that never closed. The first big accountants of the afterlife were in Mesopotamia. Around 2500 BCE, temple complexes like those at Uruk and Nippur kept ledgers listing bread and beer rations for the Gidim, the spirits of the dead. Archaeologists have found clay tablets etched with quantities so specific you can imagine some poor scribe checking off boxes. 2 jars of barley ale for the ancestor of Enheduanna, 1 sheep for the god Ningirsu. In Sumer, you didn't get a funeral. You got a supply chain. The living worked in service to the invisible economy of the underworld. Egypt turned that idea into an empire. The mortuary temple of Hatshepsut, built around 1470 BCE, had its own farmlands, bakeries, brewers, and livestock. Priests managed perpetual offerings, cycling through food and wine as though the queen might stroll in any day. The temples functioned as banks. You could deposit property as an offering and earn spiritual interest. By the New Kingdom, entire villages, like Deir el-Medina, where the tomb workers lived, existed solely to build and maintain these eternal estates. Death was a stimulus package. Maya and Aztecs had the same logic, just bloodier accounting. The Spanish friar Diego de Landa, writing in 1566, describes Yucatan priests bleeding from ears, tongues, and genitals before meals, mixing the blood with ground maize to make sacred dough. Archaeology backs it up. At Palenque and Copan, altars show dried blood traces and scorched limestone from repeated offerings. The point wasn't pain, it was payment. You didn't pray to the gods, you funded them. The Romans professionalized that. The Collegia Funeratitia, funeral guilds, offered burial insurance. Members paid monthly dues. In return, you got a proper tomb, a priest, and a few mourners who'd at least pretend to miss you. By the 1st century CE, there were hundreds of these associations across the empire. Funerals became line items in municipal budgets. Cicero complains in his letters about the excessive cost of dying. 2,000 years later, nothing's changed. Even Christianity kept the economics. By the Middle Ages, prayers for souls in purgatory came with fixed rates. A mass for your late uncle might run a few pence. Rich families sponsored chantry chapels where priests were paid to pray for them daily. Death was officially monetized, just in softer packaging. But this wasn't greed, it was organization. Death provided structure. Someone had to maintain the tombs, harvest the animals for sacrifice, copy the spells, carve the sarcophagi, clean the altars. Each of those jobs was steady work. Ancient economies depended on mortality the way ours depend on taxes. The deeper anthropology here is simple. Exchange makes the unknown bearable. If the gods or ancestors can be bribed, they can be managed. The anthropologist Marcel Mauss called it the gift. Nothing is ever free, especially not salvation. Every sacrifice, from a burnt ox to a gladiator's corpse, was a social contract. Take Rome's Suavit Aurelia, the triple sacrifice of pig, sheep, and bull before a census or military campaign. It was civic hygiene. The consul would walk the perimeter of the field, sprinkling wine and grain, while priests recited formulas word for word from wax tablets. The animal's blood sealed the border between clean and unclean space. No blood, no legitimacy. Or look east to the Shang oracle bones again. Around 1200 BCE, diviners cracked ox scapulae and turtle plastrons to question the ancestors. Should we sacrifice 10 men? Will rain come if we burn cattle? The questions were literally carved beside the cracks. These aren't myths. They're administrative records. The oldest Chinese writing exists because someone wanted to bill the dead. Among the Greeks, the transactions were just as structured. Homeric heroes held funeral games, chariot races, boxing, wrestling, to honor the dead. Winners received bronze tripods or women as prizes, and the loser's blood appeased the underworld. Fast forward to classical Athens, and death still ruled the civic calendar. Festivals like the Anthesteria opened wine jars for Dionysus and invited the dead to join the feast. On the final day, people shouted at the spirits to get out, the original closing time. The Romans perfected spectacle as sacrifice. The Colosseum's inaugural games in 80 CE killed about 9,000 animals and thousands of men. You can moralize it, but to Rome, that was liturgy. Bread for the living, blood for the gods, applause for the emperor. It was the same old equation written in sand and sinew. We keep order by feeding chaos. Anthropologists studying modern rituals see the same impulse everywhere. The sense that death must eat. The Toraja of Sulawesi still hold multi-day funerals where water buffalo are sacrificed so the soul can ride to heaven. The more buffalo, the higher the status. Economically, it's devastating. Socially, it's essential. When archaeologists excavate vast sacrificial deposits, from the 3,000 victims at the Aztec Templo Mayor to the 400 horses buried at Sarmatian sites in Kazakhstan, what they're seeing isn't insanity. It's policy. Death functions as currency, and ritual keeps the books balanced. And there's the strange beauty of it. Society spent fortunes to prove they understood the one thing nobody does. The deeper the fear, the bigger the festival. The higher the uncertainty, the thicker the blood. But look at what it built. Architecture, art, music, labor specialization, mathematics. Death-funded civilization's infrastructure. By the time medieval cathedrals rose in Europe, entire towns existed just to prepare for dying well. Masons, glassworkers, bell makers, scribes, all paid to sculpt eternity out of limestone. The bones of saints became tourist attractions. The relic trade rivaled modern finance. One monk's femur could bankroll a monastery. Death never stopped being profitable. It just switched industries. People always imagine ancient life as brutal because of all the killing. But the truth is, the killing was organized. It was rehearsed, scheduled, and ticketed. Death wasn't random. It was an event. You can measure how comfortable a society is with dying by how much of it they'll do in front of a crowd. By that metric, Rome had no competition. The first gladiatorial matches in 264 BCE were family funerals with knives. 3 pairs of slaves fought to honor the dead Decimus Brutus. The crowd liked it. So by the late Republic, every rich politician trying to win an election was sponsoring a few dozen combatants. By the time of Emperor Titus, when the Colosseum opened in 80 CE, death was mass entertainment. Those inaugural games ran for 100 days. The historian Cassius Dio says 9,000 animals and thousands of men died. Lions, elephants, prisoners, criminals, all slaughtered to mark the end of construction delays. It sounds barbaric, but it was theater. The arena was a machine that produced meaning. The emperor was the producer. The crowd was the jury. The condemned were props in a morality play about Roman order. When you watched a man die in the sand, you weren't seeing chaos. You were seeing control. The message was that Rome could choreograph death, and therefore the world. The Romans even had genres. There were venationes, hunts with exotic animals, damnationes ad bestias, public executions by mauling, and the munera, the one-on-one gladiator fights. Gladiators were celebrities, complete with sponsorships, fan clubs, and graffiti fan mail. Crescens, the net man, wins again. Some earned enough to buy their freedom, but most didn't. Gladiation probably evolved from Etruscan funerary rites, where prisoners were forced to fight at a noble's burial to provide the dead with attendance in the afterlife. Over time, Rome forgot the theology and kept the spectacle. That's the historical irony. Civilizations start with sacrifice and end with sport. The appetite wasn't unique to Rome. Every continent has its own version of ritualized killing as entertainment. The Maya, for instance, played pits, the Mesoamerican ball game that doubled as a cosmic story. Carved reliefs from the Great Ball Court at Chichen Itza, around 900 to 1000 CE, show a decapitated player kneeling while serpents and flowers burst from his neck. The imagery is not metaphorical. It's theological. The hero's head becomes maize, his blood the rain that keeps the world alive. The losers, or the winners, depending on interpretation, were sacrificed. That's not sport in the modern sense. That's agriculture in ritual form. The game reenacted the myth of the hero twins from the Popol Vuh, who descended into the underworld, outplayed the gods of death, and were reborn as the sun and moon. To watch pits was to watch the cosmos reboot. Jump north, and the Aztecs took ritual performance even further. The Tlaquexipehualestli festival, literally the flaying of men, was held every spring to honor the god Zipe Totec. Captives were sacrificed, their skin worn by priests for 20 days as a symbol of renewal. To them, this wasn't horror, it was photosynthesis. You shed the old to feed the new. Modern historians call it gruesome. Aztec priests called it necessary. The whole city came to watch, and they weren't alone. The Celts of Iron Age Europe had seasonal assemblies that mixed sport, law, and ritual. Greek funeral games, like those Achilles hosted for Patroclus, were equal parts grief and glory. Even the Vikings sent their dead off with pageantry, a burning ship, a sacrificed slave, music, mead. Ahmad ibn Fadlan, the Arab diplomat who witnessed a Rus's funeral on the Volga in 921 CE, describes a ritual where a girl volunteered to die with her master, stabbed repeatedly before being set alight on the pyre. It's disturbing, yes, but it's also procedure. Everything had rules, songs, steps. The consistency across cultures isn't coincidence, it's anthropology. When you can't explain why bad things happen, you turn suffering into ritual. Give it a stage, give it meaning, and you can live with it. Psychologists would call it transference. Sociologists might call it cohesion. But at its core, it's just humans trying to convince themselves that they're not next. The Romans understood that instinct perfectly. Spectacle was politics. Bread and circuses didn't just distract the masses, they reminded them who was safe and who wasn't. Senators sat close enough to feel the spray. It's one thing to rule people with laws, it's another to rule them with mortality. Even Christianity, which claimed to reject pagan bloodletting, kept the pageantry. The martyr cults of the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE treated execution as performance art. Crowds gathered to watch saints burned or fed to beasts, believing it purified the world. The aesthetic changed, cross instead of Colosseum, but the instinct stayed. Death makes things sacred when you give it an audience. Centuries later, medieval Europe still couldn't look away. Public executions became town festivals. Gallows draped in banners, hawkers selling snacks, priests reciting final confessions like halftime commentary. The condemned were both villain and entertainment. Michel Foucault wasn't exaggerating when he called it the theater of punishment. It's what happens when a culture's moral code doubles as its weekend plan. There's an old line that says cruelty is just curiosity with bad manners. The Romans, Aztecs, Vikings, and medieval Christians weren't uniquely cruel. They were human. Watching someone else die scratched the same psychological itch as surviving a storm. You saw the rules reassert themselves. That wasn't me. That small relief was worth a ticket. But there's another side to it. Community. These events stitched people together. In a world without TV, you didn't have mass identity until you gathered around a spectacle. The crowd in the amphitheater was Rome. The people chanting at the ball court were Chichen Itza. Ritual violence built belonging. That's the paradox. Organized death creates social life. Every civilization figured it out. consciously or not. If you want to unite thousands of strangers, you give them a moment of shared awe, and death always delivers. So when we look back at these spectacles and call them barbaric, we're missing the point. They were civilization's group therapy. The same instincts are alive today, only sanitized. We call them war movies, true crime podcasts, or boxing pay-per-views. Different rules, same dopamine. The Romans would have loved Netflix. By the time you hit the ancient world's golden age, death wasn't just spectacle, it was customer service. Every culture had a system for managing its relationship with the deceased, like an invisible second population running parallel to the living one. The Egyptians turned it into a logistics network. The Book of the Dead, which isn't one book at all, but 1,000 versions of the same spiritual travel guide, reads like an ancient visa application. You needed the right spells, passwords, and paperwork to get through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld. Spell 125 describes the weighing of the heart, where your soul faces a moral audit against the feather of Ma'at, goddess of truth. If you passed, you got eternal life. If you didn't, you were eaten by Amit, a crocodile-lion-hippo hybrid. No appeal process. The afterlife required upkeep. Even in death, you could starve. Tombs weren't just memorials. They were pantries. Reliefs at Saqqara and Thebes, circa 2400 to 1300 BCE, show servants carrying bread, beer, ducks, and onions to the tomb owner. These weren't decorative. They were blueprints for what the afterlife staff was supposed to keep delivering forever. To make sure it happened, families endowed mortuary estates, land whose profits paid for priests to perform offerings on schedule. Forget eternal rest. The dead had subscriptions. Egypt wasn't unique. Across the Mediterranean, the same idea took different forms. In Greece, families made chwai, libations poured into the ground for ancestors and left honeycakes on graves during the Genizia festival. The Romans institutionalized it with parentalia, a 9-day feast for the family dead every February. Everyone went to the tombs, ate, drank, argued, and toasted their grandparents. Cemeteries were less haunted than crowded. Roman tomb inscriptions even scolded descendants who skipped the ritual. One from 1st century CE Pompeii warns, "Do not disturb my bones. I have made provision for my rights. He who does not bring offerings, may he himself go unburied." In other words, don't ghost the dead, or they'll return the favor. The Chinese took ancestor maintenance to bureaucratic perfection. By the Zhou dynasty, 1046 to 256 BCE, ancestor worship was statecraft. The Book of Rites lays out exactly which family members get sacrifices and how many animals each deserves. Shang and Zhou kings consulted oracles not out of superstition, but administration. Their dead predecessors were considered active political consultants. When the emperor ate, he first offered food to his ancestors. If they were pleased, heaven was pleased, and the harvests followed suit. The whole cosmic chain of command depended on the intergenerational catering. Over time, that evolved into the Joss paper economy, burning model houses, money, and even paper iPhones to send to your ancestors. You still see it in modern Chinese communities during the Ghost Festival. It's the same contract written 3,000 years ago. We feed you, you protect us. Death remains a family business. The deeper logic, anthropologically, is what scholars call reciprocal obligation. The dead didn't retire. They shifted departments. They were now responsible for rain, fertility, protection, and luck. You gave them offerings not out of grief, but out of payroll discipline. That's why ancestor shrines appear almost everywhere agriculture does. Once you plant crops, you depend on timing and weather, and those things are terrifyingly uncontrollable. You need allies in the invisible world. The dead, being halfway there already, make the perfect intermediaries. You see the pattern clearly in the Andes. The Inca didn't bury their emperors. They kept them in office. Royal mummies were dressed, carried in processions, and consulted on state matters well into the 16th century. Spanish chroniclers like Cieza de Leon record Inca nobles speaking to the dead as if to the living, asking the mummified rulers for advice and loans of property. The dead owned land, servants, and even herds. When the Spanish arrived, they were horrified to find the empire run partly by corpses. To the Inca, that was just good governance. In West Africa, the Yoruba worldview revolves around Ace, the spiritual power that flows through all things, living or dead. Ancestors aren't gone. They're networked. During Egungun festivals, masked dancers embody the spirits of lineage founders, whirling through villages while the living offer food and money. The mask isn't metaphorical. For those moments, the ancestor is literally present. Anthropologists like John Peel have pointed out that these rites kept communities politically stable. You can't argue inheritance with someone who's still showing up to the party every year. Japan's relationship with death followed the same logic, though wrapped in gentler aesthetics. Shinto shrines and Buddhist temples coexisted around the idea of I.E., their household. The dead are not exiled, they're integrated. The Oban festival each summer welcomes ancestral spirits back home with lanterns and dance. Archaeologists trace this continuity from the Kofun period, 250 to 538 CE, tombs, with their keyhole mounds filled with bronze mirrors, to today's altars lined with family photos and rice offerings. Across all these systems, the through line isn't fear, it's participation. The dead are stakeholders. Every major civilization built an infrastructure to manage them, because not managing them was worse. You can see how that mindset lingers in language itself. Words for soul often overlap with breath, wind, or shadow. They're not abstract, they're environmental. When the ancient Egyptians spoke of Ka and Ba, they weren't theorizing about metaphysics. They were describing motion. Something leaves the body, hovers, returns, and dreams. You interact with it. You give it beer. You build it a house. Anthropology makes it clear that belief in an afterlife didn't start from religion. It started from experience. People dreamed of their dead relatives, heard echoes in the wind, saw reflections in water, and thought, they're not gone. The ritual came later. The historian of religion, Robert Hertz, put it bluntly in 1907. The dead man is not dead all at once. Every culture just found a way to make that transitional period livable. So while the Roman held his parentalia and the Inca marched their mummies, the principle was the same. Stay on good terms with your predecessors, because the alternative wasn't atheism, it was cosmic anarchy. Once people got tired of merely feeding the dead, they started grading them. That's how you end up with heaven, hell, paradise, purgatory, karma, and all the other cosmic report cards. You can trace the shift almost precisely in time. Around the late Bronze Age, 1200 BCE onward, societies began moralizing the afterlife. Death stopped being logistics and became justice. The Egyptians were first to formalize it. Their afterlife wasn't one size fits all. It was performance-based. The negative confession, part of the Book of the Dead, lists 42 sins you had to deny before the gods. I have not stolen. I have not slain. I have not polluted the river. It reads like a preemptive court defense. The dead stood before Osiris. Their hearts weighed on a scale. It's not coincidence that this idea emerged alongside Egypt's rise as a bureaucratic empire. When you invent taxation, you invent judgment. The Persians took it further. Zoroaster, preaching around 1000 BCE, gave the world a terrifying innovation: duality. Good versus evil, light versus darkness, Ahura Mazda versus Angra Mainyu. After death, your soul crossed the Chinvat Bridge. The righteous passed easily into paradise. The wicked fell screaming into a pit. It was the moral universe turned literal. You didn't just die. You got audited by cosmic accountants. Zoroastrianism was the blueprint for later monotheisms. The Hebrews borrowed the idea during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, transforming Sheol, once a neutral underworld, into something moral. By the 2nd century BCE, Jewish texts like Daniel and Enoch were describing resurrection and divine judgment. Christianity inherited it wholesale, a final reckoning where everyone answers for everything. Islam, centuries later, refined it to a system of perfect symmetry. Deeds weighed on scales, records written by angels, paradise gardens for the faithful, fire for the rest. It's tempting to think these were all theological leaps, but they were also social tools. When you can't police everyone in life, promise they'll be policed in death. You don't need a standing army if guilt does the work for you. In India, the same centuries birthed a different kind of immortality. The Vedas, written around 1500 to 500 BCE, started with ritual rebirth. Ancestors fed through fire offerings. But the Upanishad flipped the script. The soul, Atman, wasn't recycled through ritual. It was the universe. Rebirth became personal. Karma was the new ledger. It was elegant math. Actions accumulate moral weight, and the universe keeps receipts. No middlemen, no temples required. The system was self-regulating. You didn't need Osiris or St. Peter. Your own behavior built your next body. That idea spread across Asia. Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, each adjusting the formula. Life wasn't a test you could pass. It was an equation you could balance over lifetimes. Anthropologists note that these developments happen when societies grow large enough that interpersonal trust fails. In a village, reputation is enforcement. In an empire, you need something bigger. Divine justice becomes the surveillance system. And yet, moralized afterlives weren't purely about punishment. They were stories about fairness. People wanted the universe to make sense. When the wicked prospered, heaven and hell became narrative corrections. Take the ancient Greeks. Their early Hades, as Homer described it around the 8th century BCE, was dull equality. Everyone wandered as a shadow, kings and beggars alike. But by the 4th century BCE, Plato's myth of air introduced moral sorting, heroes ascending, villains tormented. By the time of Virgil's Aeneid, 1st century BCE, Elysium was reserved for the virtuous, Tartarus for the damned. The system evolved in real time with empire, because an empire needs cosmic bureaucracy to match its earthly one. Rome, of course, imported everything. By the 2nd century CE, funerary art shows souls being guided by Mercury to judgment scenes straight out of Egyptian iconography. The message was simple. Even if the Senate can't find you guilty, someone upstairs will. The idea of earning eternity also explains why sacrifice and charity start overlapping in these periods. Feeding the poor became a down payment on the afterlife. Egyptian tomb texts brag about distributing bread. Roman epitaphs mention donations to the public baths. Christian doctrine codified it. Salvation through works. You could buy your way upward with moral accounting. Meanwhile, in the Americas, death's cosmology remained cyclical rather than judicial. The Aztec underworld, Mictlan, wasn't moral, it was navigational. Every soul had to pass 9 levels, battling winds, jaguars, mountains that crushed together like jaws until it reached rest. Warriors and women who died in childbirth skipped the line, reborn as hummingbirds escorting the sun. Even here, meaning came through pattern. Sacrifice equaled continuation. Among the Maya, the Xibalba myth did the same work the Christian Passion story later would. The hero twins die, descend, outwit the lords of death, and resurrect. It's not morality, it's endurance. The universe survives because someone faces death and wins. If you zoom out, you see a fascinating shift. Early civilizations dealt with death as maintenance. Later ones turned it into ethics. Somewhere between the pyramids and the parables, humanity decided death wasn't just an end. It was a mirror. But moralizing death came with side effects. Once you define good and evil, you get heresy. Once you define paradise, you get the power to sell tickets. By the Middle Ages, indulgences, prayers, and donations traded for reduced time in purgatory had become spiritual currency. Martin Luther's rebellion in 1517 wasn't just theology, it was accounting reform. Even outside religion, the same mechanics held. Confucian filial piety promised immortality through reputation. Norse sagas promised Valhalla for warriors, hell for the unlucky. The Celtic otherworld offered endless feasts for those brave enough to die well. Heaven and hell, karma and reincarnation, Valhalla and Helheim. They're all different packaging for the same anxiety. That death must be organized, and someone has to decide who deserves what. By the time Dante wrote the Divine Comedy in the early 1300s, death had become a census. He mapped the afterlife like a city planner. Sins were zoning categories. Pride went in circle 1, gluttony in circle 3, betrayal in the basement. Heaven wasn't infinite. It was bureaucratic. It made sense to a world run by clerks and kings. If you ever wondered why people in the Renaissance could design flying machines but still fund inquisitions, this is why. When the moral universe is ledger-based, doubt becomes debt. By the 19th century, we traded sacrifices for cemeteries. The blood dried up, but the business didn't. Industrialization didn't make death go away. It just professionalized it. The Victorians, for all their black lace and piety, were the first to turn dying into a full-time industry. Undertakers replaced priests. Embalmers replaced priests and family. You didn't bury your dead anymore. You outsourced them. That change started in America during the Civil War. Embalming wasn't invented for sentimentality. It was logistics. Bodies had to travel hundreds of miles home without decomposing. Dr. Thomas Holmes, a surgeon who preserved corpses with arsenic solutions, reportedly treated over 4,000 Union soldiers. When Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, his embalmed body was displayed on a 1,600-mile funeral train from Washington to Springfield. People lined the tracks for days to watch a corpse pass by. The closest thing to television the century had. Death had become a national broadcast. From there, the funeral parlor replaced the family parlor. Victorians turned grief into etiquette. Manuals taught how to dress, how long to mourn. and what color lace matched which relative's death. Mourning jewelry contained locks of hair. Middle-class homes displayed post-mortem photographs. Portraits of the dead posed upright, eyes painted open. It wasn't morbid. It was proof that you could still control the uncontrollable. Europe was no different. Paris built Père Lachaise Cemetery in 1804. London built Highgate in 1839. Sprawling necropolises for the industrial dead. The reasoning was sanitary at first. Cities were choking on their own graveyards. But it quickly became architectural. A good cemetery was a resume. You could stroll through the afterlife like a museum of bourgeois respectability. Angels for bankers, columns for colonels, sarcophagi for anyone who could afford marble. The Victorians were obsessed with displaying virtue through death. The tombstone wasn't just a memorial, it was branding. Even mourning had class divisions. The poor were buried in common graves, stacked layer upon layer, while the wealthy were embalmed and sealed like luxury products. Death was democratized in principle, but privatized in practice, much like everything else in the industrial age. Across the Atlantic, the American funeral industry grew fat on that model. The General Funeral Directors Association was founded in 1882, with trade magazines and conventions. Coffins became caskets. The word change wasn't accidental. Coffin implied death. Casket implied a keepsake. Same corpse, better marketing. And it worked. By the 20th century, funerals were fully commodified. The embalmed, suited body in an expensive box became the standard of respect. In 1963, Jessica Mitford's The American Way of Death exposed the industry's pricing tricks. Grief packages, markups on vault linings, protective seal fees that did nothing but soothe anxiety. It's the same psychology that once sold indulgences. The church promised spiritual security. The mortician promised chemical immortality. But this wasn't just capitalism. It was cultural denial. Industrial society needed its workers alive and productive, not meditating on mortality. Death moved out of public view. Hospitals replaced home deaths. Crematoriums replaced graveyards near churches. And the rituals that once grounded grief dissolved into paperwork. The dying were sequestered, and the living kept busy. In Japan, Meiji-era reforms did the same thing. Cremation, once a Buddhist ritual, became state policy. Cemeteries were reorganized, death certificates standardized. In Victorian England, the same bureaucrat who inspected your factory inspected your burial permit. Death became part of the supply chain. You can track this shift in architecture. Medieval Europe had charnel houses. Bone collections built right beside churches, reminders of decay. Memento mori was carved into door frames. By 1900, those skulls had been replaced by marble angels and manicured lawns. Cemeteries went suburban. Death was landscaped. There's something telling about that. We stopped needing the gods to organize our mortality, but we still needed someone to tidy it. Meanwhile, science entered the conversation and kicked the soul out of it. By the mid-19th century, Darwin, Pasteur, and Freud had replaced priestly explanations with biology and psychology. Heaven and hell shrank into metaphor. Death became a biological event. And when you reduce death to biology, you lose the built-in coping mechanism of meaning. That's when the seance industry took off. Spiritualism, born in 1848 with the Fox sisters in New York, was the logical backlash. Science said there was no afterlife. Technology said maybe there's a signal. Telegraphs were brand new, and people started to wonder, if we can send messages across wires, Why not across the veil? Seances, ectoplasm photography, table rapping. All attempts to reboot communication with the dead in the age of machinery. Even Thomas Edison, by the 1920s, publicly claimed to be working on a spirit phone. He wasn't, but the idea sold papers. The Victorians didn't lose their fascination with death. They just changed its interface. Anthropologists sometimes describe this modern transition as death's domestication. The ancients negotiated with it. The medievals moralized it. The moderns outsourced it. We turned the ultimate mystery into a service sector. Even our language softened. We say passed away, not died. We say remains, not body. Euphemism replaced ritual. The old cultures built monuments to confront death. We built industries to hide it. But repression doesn't erase obsession. Modern media made death public again. Sanitized, distant, consumable. The newspaper obituary evolved into a social media post. The Colosseum became the screen. We still gather to witness death. We just call it news, and somewhere in that transformation, death stopped belonging to the community. It became property. You pay rent for your resting place, fees for perpetual care, licenses for scattering ashes. The economics of the afterlife didn't vanish. It just switched currencies. If an ancient Egyptian looked at a modern funeral home, they'd recognize the principle immediately. Permanence through payment, ritual through contract. They'd probably just ask where the incense went. Every generation swears it's less superstitious than the last. Every generation also creates new ways to ritualize dying. The paradox is older than civilization. We can't stop organizing death, even when we pretend we've outgrown it. When you strip it down, humanity's entire history is just an ongoing argument with mortality. The Sumerians carved myths to explain it. The Egyptians engineered pyramids to outrun it. The Greeks debated it. The Christians moralized it. And the Victorians monetized it. Every time we think we've escaped it, we invent another method to bring it back into order. A new system, a new technology, a new way to pretend the end is manageable. We no longer build ziggurats, but we upload photos of the dead to cloud servers. We embalm with preservatives instead of resin, write wills instead of hieroglyphs, and light LED candles that never burn out. Death went digital. The ritual stayed analog. Even the language of technology borrows from the tomb. Cloud storage, legacy data, ghost accounts. Silicon Valley talks like an afterlife cult, eternal memory, disembodied presence, a promise that nothing really ends if you pay the subscription fee. It's the same logic as ancient Egypt, just with Wi-Fi. Anthropologists call this continuity symbolic immortality, the attempt to keep yourself in circulation after you're gone. And no civilization has ever escaped it. The only difference is how we frame it. Gods, glory, genealogy, or gigabytes. But if you really want to see how old our obsession runs, look at what happens during disaster. Every time the world shakes, floods, or burns, the oldest reflexes come back instantly. After the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, survivors built new shrines for drowned ancestors. After September 11th, New Yorkers covered fences with candles and photos like medieval votive walls. During the COVID-19 pandemic, online memorials became digital equivalents of ancestor altars, playlists instead of prayers, live stream funerals replacing processions. We're not modern. We're just better at hiding how old we still are. Even in secular countries, the rituals never stopped. They just got quieter and more bureaucratic. Hospitals have protocols for post-mortem dignity. Airlines have procedures for transporting remains. Death certificates replaced oracles. But the instinct is the same. Name it, document it, file it, make it behave. The sociologist Ernest Becker called it the denial of death. His 1973 book argued that civilization itself is a defense mechanism. Everything we build, create, and believe in is an elaborate distraction from mortality. He might have been right. But there's another way to see it. Maybe we don't deny death at all. Maybe we're just trying to keep it in conversation. When you go back through history with that lens, the pattern is obvious. Every civilization made peace with death through repetition. Ritual wasn't superstition, it was rehearsal. You offered blood, prayers, or flowers, not because you thought it would cheat the inevitable, but because it made you part of the same story everyone else was telling. Death only feels unbearable when it's private. Make it collective, and it turns into culture. That's why the Romans filled amphitheaters, the Aztecs filled temples, and we fill feeds. It's all one long act of shared witnessing. When you know you'll die, watching someone else do it first is a strange kind of relief. It's also why the ancients weren't as morbid as we make them out to be. They were pragmatic. Death wasn't the opposite of life. It was one of its functions. The Egyptians called tombs houses of eternity. The Chinese saw ancestors as management. And the Maya literally played death as a sport. They didn't avoid the subject. They built their worlds around it. The only people who treat death as taboo are the ones who can afford to forget it. Modern life gives you that privilege, until it doesn't. The ancient world didn't have that luxury. When crops failed, when plague came, when your average lifespan hovered around 35, ignoring death was impossible. So they did the smart thing. They made it familiar. Maybe that's the real through line. Familiarity. Death has always been part of the furniture of civilization. The difference is where we keep it. The ancients built it into their architecture. Temples, tombs, city layouts aligned with solstices and afterworlds. We build it into our entertainment, our insurance, our algorithms. Different era, same interior design problem. How do you live with something that won't leave the room? Look around long enough, and you'll see the old patterns everywhere. The candle vigils, the fascination with serial killers, the endless recycling of apocalypse stories. Every horror movie, every funeral, every myth is a small echo of the same bargain. If I look at it long enough, maybe it won't surprise me. And that's the irony. For all our progress, we still need to ritualize the inevitable. We just use better lighting. So, why was every civilization obsessed with death? Because death is the only constant that makes civilization possible. You can't build permanence without something to contrast it against. The pyramids, the cathedrals, the skyscrapers, they all point at the same problem. Time doesn't stop, but maybe stone or story or data can slow it down. When the Egyptians weighed hearts, when the Romans built arenas, when monks carved skulls into manuscripts, when Victorians posed with corpses, when we scroll through memorial posts, it's all the same gesture, trying to touch the edge without falling off. And if there's something comforting buried in that, it's this. The obsession isn't really with death. It's with continuity. Every offering, every monument, every algorithm that saves a name is a small rebellion against oblivion. We can dress it up as faith, art, or anything in between. But at the end of the day, it's just people trying to talk to time, to say, we were here, and to hope something somewhere, remembers. The ancients made sacrifices. We make archives. But it's the same instinct, a refusal to let silence have the last word. Now, with that, we wrap up the history of death, sacrifice, and the ways in which we viewed the unviewable throughout time and different cultures. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Until the next time, take care.